Now, share screen. Okay. Oops. Which one of these do I want? This one. I think this is the one I want. Okay, so one thing oops, sorry. Uh, One thing I think it would be good to do at the beginning of this lecture is to kind of, I know you watched the one from last week, but I think since the 19th century is like a series of art movements, and the idea is to learn the names of those art movements and be able to kind of explain how they evolved in the same way that you explained how, you know, Greek sculpture evolved or European cathedrals evolved. Now we're talking mainly about painting, and mainly painting in France. Um, and the 19th century is just one movement after another: neoclassicism, romanticism, realism, impressionism, blah blah blah. So there were all these isms. They all ended ism. You know, artists kept coming up with new theories about what painting should be. So I'm just going to kind of review the ones that we talked about last week, and that was neoclassicism. Too bad I don't have a whiteboard. But this is in your book. The word is spelled out. So it's the style is neoclassicism around the time of the French Revolution, exemplified by this guy David. There were other ones, but David is the one that we kind of looked at. And then there was sort of a reaction against neoclassicism, and that was called romanticism, that was characterized by visible brushwork, very emotional subject matter, and ordinary people, landscapes, as opposed to the sort of kings and mythology of neoclassicism. Now, that neoclassical style did not go away. Let's just be clear about that. It persisted for another couple of hundred years or more, because it was really popular. This sort of smooth finish that almost looks like a photograph, although there was no photograph in 1784, and the subject matter being mythology or history or sentimental subjects of one type or another. That sort of became what's called academic art, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So whereas this other stuff, romanticism, impressionism, realism, that was all avant-garde. That was sort of like not the official art of the academy. Okay, so this is an example of the, believe it or not, of the official art of the French Academy. So France had a whole system of teaching art and training artists, and it was the academy system. So you had to get admitted to the academy, and then once you were in the École des Beaux-Arts, which still exists, you had to learn, to draw realistically. You had to learn human anatomy. You had to do figure studies. You had to learn linear perspective and the properties of paint. And then you were supposed to go on to make paintings about mythological subjects. So you may be a little confused about what's going on in this painting, and that's understandable because it couldn't happen in real life. And that is, let me see if I can move this dumb little thing over here. All right. This is a story from Greek mythology or Roman mythology or something, where this sculptor, Pygmalion, that's the man, Pygmalion, he is making a sculpture out of marble. You can see that. That's what this part is. And he falls in love with his own artwork. And somehow, magically, that statue comes to life. And that's the moment you see here where Pygmalion is going, oh my God, she's real. Sort of like in the Frankenstein movie. It lives! It lives! Anyway, in the background, you see this Cupid shooting an arrow at them and making them fall in love. Okay, so this is pretty ridiculous, but this is the kind of stuff that in the mid-19th century, 1860 or so, was all the rage in Paris and the rest of Europe, I guess. And this artist, Jerome, was wildly successful making silly paintings like this, what seems silly to us. Okay, so there was also a lot of this mess. Sorry to say that, but all right. So remember when we were learning about the Renaissance, we learned about the birth of Venus, which is a mythological story that from Greek or Roman mythology, where the goddess Venus, also known as Aphrodite to the Greeks, is born out on the ocean somewhere and is wafted ashore, sometimes as a grown woman, sometimes on a shell, or sometimes like here, just on the waves. So that's what we're seeing here. And she's surrounded by these little naked cherubs with wings that are flying around her. That's a common thing in these academic paintings, is fat naked babies with wings. And she's pretty unrealistic too. She characteristically of these paintings, she has hair down to her knees or further. But that's the only hair she has, right? She has no pubic hair, no hair on her legs, no hair under her arms, no little hair sprouting out of her nipples. I mean, either she got a very thorough wax job or she's just not very real. She's a goddess, of course. So nobody's ever seen Venus. Okay, so here's another example of that same subject. And she's got a seashell this time. Yay. And she's being wafted ashore. She's playing with her hair. She's not looking at you, the viewer. And she hardly ever is in these paintings. The naked babies are there. And also all these other mythological figures, like these sort of mermen or something that are blowing on a horn. And I don't know what she is, a sea nymph of some sort. And then again, a baby riding on a dolphin. He's got little reins that he's steering the dolphin with. And of course, the baby has wings. So the whole thing is not something that you or I have ever seen or ever will see. It's just kind of crazy. But this is academic painting of the mid-19th century. Okay, here's a little selection of academic painting. A lot of it involves these goddesses playing with their hair, very long hair. But there's also history paintings, like the death of Queen Elizabeth or something here, and fairly recent history, actually, Napoleon crossing the Alps. This one's called Romans of the Decadence. And this is a scene from a Shakespeare play called Macbeth. So these are all acceptable subject matters for ambitious academy-trained artists who want to sell a lot of paintings. Here's one that is a classic history painting. It's called The Death of General Wolfe. Here's General Wolfe. He's a British guy. He's involved in the French. This happened in Canada. He was killed in a war, or the French and Indian Wars, I think is what they're called. And he's surrounded by his officers. He's been shot with a mini ball, I guess, and he's bleeding, but you don't see much blood. And he's sort of gazing up into the heavens, so you assume that he's going to be assumed into heaven, sort of like a god or something. So it's not messy. It's not very realistic. It's not at all like what war in the early 19th century was like. If you've read any books about that, you know that it was horrible. I mean, I just finished reading War and Peace, and Prince Andrei dies a long and lingering death that takes him months to die from a grenade. So this is a sort of sanitized history painting, you could say. But history paintings are big. This could be 10 feet wide and 8 feet tall. And, they have this smooth finish. There's no visible brush strokes. And the subject matter is supposed to be edifying or making you a better person to look at it. So, I thought I had a slide in here that showed the salons. Maybe it's back at the beginning here. The salon, I guess I took that slide out. Anyway, these paintings were at big exhibits called the Salon. There were 2 salons, one in the spring and one in the fall. And they were hung salon style. That is, when you go to the Frisch Museum now, the paintings are going to be lined up kind of in a row, one painting at a time. But these paintings were hung sort of floor to ceiling. So there were paintings way high up, there were paintings way low down. But the salon was a huge deal. Thousands of people would come to see the paintings in the spring and the fall at the salons. It was like a big social event as well as a artistic event. It was a much bigger deal than an art show would be now in Nashville or something. It was like when a new Star Wars movie comes out or something. Okay, but there was a whole other, in the mid-19th century, there was a whole other, well, this is early 20th century, but it's a good example of what we call the avant-garde. So what is the avant-garde? The avant-garde is sort of the opposite of academic art in the sense that instead of obeying the rules of academic art about subject matter and smooth finish and history painting and all that, the avant-garde artist just sort of went his or her own way. They might have been trained at the academy and they might have the ability to make an academic style painting, but they just didn't want to for reasons that we're about to get into. Okay, so I'm gonna have to move this down here. Oops, sorry, I'm gonna have to sort of, all right, so now we're talking about the first avant-garde movement of the 19th century, you could say, and that is what's called realism. So what is realism? Realism is was in sort of a word. I mean, you might already have been talking about certain paintings as being realistic, and that's okay. But this is an art movement with a capital R, realism, and it means more than just it looks realistic. So realism to Courbet, this artist here, who sort of invented it, was a reaction against academic art. That is, his famous saying was, "Show me an angel and I'll paint an angel." In other words, he's saying, look, those little naked babies with wings that you always paint flying around a naked woman, that's ridiculous. Nobody's ever seen one of those. And so he took it upon himself to start making large oil paintings about ordinary events and ordinary people. That is, the people from Orléans in particular, his part of France, where he came from. He was not from Paris. He moved to Paris to become an artist, but he was really from the country, you could say, from rural France. And so a lot of his paintings are about rural France, the landscape, the people. This painting doesn't exist anymore, but fortunately a color photograph of it was made before it was destroyed in World War II. The Nazis tried to steal it, and while they were stealing it, the Allies bombed their trucks, and so the painting disappeared. But fortunately, a photograph was made. So there's a lot of things about this painting that are weird for the time, for the mid-19th century. One is that it just shows ordinary people doing a very ordinary thing, that is building a road. If you've ever done work like this, you know it's really hard work. That is carrying rocks around, breaking rocks with a hammer. Fortunately, we don't have to do that anymore because they come in different sizes at the quarry. But even if you've ever just gone to get a dump truck or a pickup load of rock at the quarry and then tried to unload it on your driveway, it's about the hardest work you can imagine doing. And so the two people in this photo, in this painting, one is a sort of older man and one is a boy, and they're doing this really hard work, presumably because they can't get any other work for various reasons. And you don't even see their faces really. I mean, in a traditional painting, the emphasis would be on the face and the hands. But Courbet has treated the entire subject matter with the same amount of attention and care. Like this kind of hoe, big hoe thing. He's drawn that and their clogs with as much care as he's drawn their face or their hands. I don't know what this is back here. Maybe their water bucket. So the whole, everything is equal, kind of. This basket, the shoes, the hands, it's all sort of treated with the same amount of care. And if we could see this painting in person, we would see that the brush strokes are visible. He hasn't smoothed them all out like David would have done. Okay, so this is an even bigger Courbet painting. So it's on the scale of history painting. I think this one's like 20 feet long or something. But the subject matter is not what academic art was supposed to be. In other words, it's a burial or a funeral, actually the burial part of the funeral, in Ornans, where he was from, a very small and to Parisians insignificant town in France. It would be like if you made a painting of a funeral in Livingston or Allgood and tried to show it in New York, you know. I mean, now that would work, basically because of Courbet. But at the time, that was considered super radical and weird. Okay, so let's just sort of break down this painting and see what's going on here. All right, because it took me a while to figure out. It's not necessarily obvious if you're not from Ornans or from the 19th century. So there's a hole here. That's the grave. This is the grave digger. And actually, he's pulled out a skull, which is somewhere over here. I can't see it very well, but there's a great video that you really should watch in the content that zooms in on the details of this huge painting. And there's a skull down here somewhere. All right, so the grave digger has dug the grave. This is a priest, a Catholic priest. These are altar boys. And then these are the pallbearers, you could say. And this is the coffin that's draped with some kind of fabric. And then there's a guy carrying a cross with a crucifix on it. It looks sort of like it's in the landscape, but it's not. It's on a pole and he's carrying it. And then these guys with the red hats are important people in the town, like the mayor and so on. And then you have various other kind of men here, and then a whole gaggle of women over here that aren't even looking, most of them, in the direction of the grave. Some of them are looking over here. And then there's a little kid right here and a dog. And the dog's just sort of looking over in another direction. He just sort of wandered in. So this is actually based on the funeral of Courbet's uncle. It's so, you know, it may be based on actual people or an event that he actually witnessed. And in the background, you can see the landscape of Ornans and these big cliffs that are there. So this kind of painting really scandalized people in Paris because he's making a claim, really, that wouldn't sound weird to us, but was certainly weird in the 19th century, which is that the daily events of country people in 1849 in a small town were just as important as, say, Napoleon. Because history painting was all about people like Napoleon, right? The former emperor of France. But he's saying, okay, these are not kings. These are not mythological figures. These are not Venuses. This kid here is not a baby with wings. These are just people. But they're important, and I'm going to make a gigantic painting about them and their lives. So that's kind of the claim of realism, that ordinary people doing ordinary things in an ordinary place are important enough that there should be great big paintings about them. And again, when you look at the video, you'll see that the brush strokes are visible. It's not from a distance like we're seeing it now. You don't see the brush strokes, but when you get close, you can. So Courbet is also drawing attention to the fact that this is a painting. He's not trying to fool you into thinking you're looking through a window at a real scene. It's a painting. It's paint on a two-dimensional surface. Okay, so another artist in the realism tradition is Manet, who also lives in Paris at this time, but he's an actual Parisian. And Manet wants to take this idea of Courbet's, of realism, that is painting ordinary people, real people in contemporary times, their times, that is the mid-19th century, and in an ordinary place like a park in Paris, the Bois de Boulogne, as a matter of fact, which was a big park. It was even there in the 60s when my family lived in England for a year in the 60s, and we went on a vacation to Paris, which was it was a weird vacation because we were camping in Paris in the Bois de Boulogne in a tiny little trailer pulled by a little Volkswagen, but it was pretty memorable. And that park is where this is happening, apparently. Okay, so let's just sort of, again, talk about what's going on here. But first, so there's two men, Parisian men, dressed in the standard kind of garb of the bourgeois man. That is a black suit, essentially. But then there's this woman sitting with them in the park. They're not looking at her, and they're not looking at you, the viewer. But the woman is looking right at you, and she's naked as a jaybird, right? She's not nude in the sense that those Venus goddesses were gloriously and idealistically beautiful, perfectly beautiful. She's just kind of an ordinary nude. I mean, you probably noticed that if you sit down like this, there is a little fold right there where your tummy fat kind of rolls over. And Manet has not erased that. He's like, yep, it's there. So, and her clothes are here and some kind of a picnic that maybe they haven't started eating yet. But then, oddly, there's this other woman apparently getting in a pond or a creek or something. And she's sort of half dressed. But the other thing that's weird about her is that although she's in the background, she's not that much smaller than this woman. So, looking at this, the viewer would think, wait a minute, didn't Manet go to the École des Beaux-Arts? Didn't he study atmospheric perspective? Doesn't he know that figures should be smaller in the background? That's painting 101. But he's not doing that. Yes, he does. Hint, he does know that. He's breaking that rule on purpose and breaking a lot of other rules on purpose. All right, so also another thing you learn at the academy is modeling the figure to show its mass, right? So there should be chiaroscuro, there should be light and dark, showing the contours of the body and the mass of the body. But he's painted her flat, as if she doesn't have volume or mass, as if she's just kind of a paper doll cutout pasted on the painting. So that's kind of weird. And a lot of people were upset that there was a naked woman in a park with two dressed men, but that was silly because there were tons of paintings in the Louvre from the Renaissance exactly like that. So we're going to look at one. All right, this is a painting from the Renaissance times, and it shows two naked goddesses or nymphs hanging out with two clothed dandies, as you would say, or well-dressed bourgeois men from a town somewhere. And one of them has a lute, and one of the nymphs seems to have a recorder or a penny whistle or something. I like to think it's a penny whistle since I play the penny whistle, or tin whistle as it's called. And this woman's getting some water out of a spring or something. So this kind of scene which is the genre of it in French is called the fête champêtre. That is the party in the fields, where you go out in the fields and you just maybe take your clothes off and play music and have a great time. So it's not like that subject matter was out of bounds for art. It wasn't, but for some reason people noticed. Well, they noticed that this woman looks quite different from these women. These are carefully modeled. Their figures, their bodies are somewhat idealized. Oops, I don't know why it does that. But she's just flat. So all kinds of rules are being broken here. And it upset a lot of people. And this painting was not accepted into the salon. But Manet tried again, and this painting was accepted into the salon, I think. Maybe, yeah. All right, so again, it's an ordinary woman. He actually used the same model, Victorine Meurent, who was his favorite model. And here you have a woman reclining on a bed, and a servant of some sort is presenting her with some flowers, and then there's a cat who seems alarmed. His back is up. And she, like the previous woman, is looking right at you. And like the previous woman, her body is not modeled carefully. It's pretty flat, except for her hands, which is weird because normally it would be her abdomen and breasts that were carefully modeled if it was a traditional painting. So actually, it may be that I may have them mixed up. It may be that this one was rejected and the other one was accepted. I can't remember right now. But you can look that up if you want to. All right, so why was this? Again, this is a violation of the tradition of the female nude because this is not Venus. This is basically a high-end prostitute. And any Parisian viewer would understand that. There was a whole hierarchy of prostitution in Paris at the time with, streetwalkers at the bottom and then these sort of courtesans or mid-level prostitutes who, didn't actually try to solicit men on the street, but they were still prostitutes. And then you had these high-end courtesans who were sort of kept women. And all that everybody knew about that in Paris. It was just something that middle-class people didn't talk about. But here, Manet has sort of put it in your face. So how do we know she's a prostitute? Apparently the name Olympia was a common pseudonym for prostitutes. Like, you probably heard of people having a porn name or a stripper name or something. Like if you're going to be a stripper, you probably want to change your name and have a different name while you're doing that, or a pole dancer or whatever. So the same is true for 19th century prostitution. So first of all, the subject matter is confrontational. Like he's forcing middle-class Parisians to kind of look at their own human trafficking, you could say. And, he's not hiding that or idealizing it. It's an ordinary woman. She's pretty, but not perfect. I mean, her features are not exactly symmetrical and so on. But how do we know what actual moment is this? Well, art historians say this is the moment where the customer arrives. How do we know? Because she sort of sits up and looks right at the customer. The customer maybe has brought some flowers that her maid is presenting to her. And then the cat is alarmed. The cat doesn't know you, the customer. Maybe you're a new customer. Anyway, the cat's going, ah, like that. So all of those are sort of clues as to what this minute that we're looking at is, which implicates you, the viewer. That means you're the John. You're the customer, which is an uncomfortable position for, a middle-class bourgeois man at the salon to be confronted with this. And there was a lot of criticism of this painting also, and even cartoons in the newspaper mocking her hands and her feet, which people said looked dirty. I mean, but let's just look. All right, so it's a fairly traditional painting in a lot of ways. Here's again a Renaissance painting by Titian that's in the Louvre. So Manet had seen this painting, and he could base his own painting on this. Instead of a cat, she has a cute little dog. All right, so this is a Venus, right? A goddess reclining on a couch, similar to the way that the Olympia is reclining. She's got her hand over her vulva here so that you can't see it. And her abdomen and breasts are modeled in a very voluptuous and sexy way. So this is, and her face is ideally beautiful. So this is academic art, you know, based on Renaissance. Uh-oh, my battery's dying. So I gotta go get the battery. So this is academic art based on Renaissance anatomy, anatomical study, and linear perspective, and chiaroscuro, and all the things that the Renaissance Italian artists discovered. That's what academic art is based on. But those are the very things that 19th century painters are rebelling against, really. They're saying, okay, this Renaissance stuff has been around since 1500. Don't you think we could do things a little differently for a change? And you know, it's interesting to think about how the invention of photography in the mid-19th century might have motivated that change. Like, you know, if there was no color photography yet until the early 20th century, but, you know, if you can make a photograph of something and make it look perfectly representational that way, you sort of have to wonder why academic painting, even though it wasn't about realistic looking subject matter, would even be a thing. Like, you know, so I think that's one of the reasons that painters started experimenting with different styles of painting. Okay, especially Monet, who we're going to talk about later. But now we're moving on to a new movement in art, Impressionism. Okay, so we talked about neoclassicism, neoclassicism, romanticism, realism, and now in the third quarter of the 19th century, Impressionism. And Monet is the main person we're going to be studying in regard to Impressionism, but he's not the only Impressionist. This is just one of his paintings, but we're going to, all right, so this is the first Impressionist painting. And the Impressionists were not in the salons, the big exhibits of academic painting, because they didn't paint in that style. They had their own exhibitions. They mounted their own exhibitions, which was really unusual in the 19th century. So Monet would just, instead of painting in his studio based on drawings and sketches and things, Monet went out into the landscape and just painted what was in front of him, what he saw. And he didn't, and the paintings were not highly finished. That is, they didn't have a smooth surface. They were textured. You know, the paint was put on a la prima. There weren't like layers of glazes and things like that. It was just a touch of orange here next to a little bit of blue. And this, from a distance, kind of gives you the impression of a sunrise, or maybe it's a sunset. Oh, sunrise, with the light from the sun sort of glittering on the water, and maybe there's a boat here and some other ships and steamboats and cranes and so on. So it's a harbor. I think it's Le Havre, and it's kind of an industrial harbor with, you know, sort of like the ship channel in Houston is what it reminds me of, where a lot of goods are coming in and going out. It's not a picturesque scene necessarily. It's just a sort of industrial scene. So when critics saw this, they were kind of outraged, again, by another form of avant-garde art, because it wasn't finished. It looked like a sketch or an impression. And that's one of the criticisms of it. Okay. All right, so that lack of finish, this is a female impressionist, Berthe Morisot. So there were some female painters among the impressionists, including an American, Mary Cassatt. So impressionism was a style that, this is really the first time we see a lot of successful female painters, I feel like, in France or Europe, or really, and definitely not, there weren't many in America. But with impressionism at the end of the 19th century, female painters sort of came into their own, including Berthe Morisot. So you can see that this is a baby in a crib with a kind of a mosquito net or something over the crib and a curtain, and maybe the mother sort of gazing at the baby. And you can see that the mosquito netting or whatever it is has been rendered with sort of quick brush strokes that are, she didn't try to draw it exactly the way it was. She didn't even try to draw, I mean, this is a good drawing, it's proportioned and everything, but it's not what you would call a careful photorealistic painting of a person's head. Now, Berthe Morisot could do that. She was trained to do it, but she's working in this impressionist style, which has the appearance of being kind of quickly dashed off. And that lack of finish is one of the important characteristics of impressionist painting. And it's what people love about it now, but in the 19th century, it was considered weird. One of the other characteristics of impressionist painting is that a lot of it centers on the landscape and on leisure time in the landscape. Bourgeois people from Paris, maybe, who have taken the train out to the countryside and are kind of having a nice Saturday or Sunday walk in the country. So that's what a lot of impressionist paintings are about. And why would that be weird or avant-garde? Well, the reason is that landscape as a genre, as a type of painting, was not considered worthy of an ambitious painter until really the mid-19th century, and especially until Impressionism. So sure, there's figures here. There's a woman with an umbrella, a little kid, maybe a boy, another woman with another kid, and the wind is blowing the ribbons on her hat around, and there's these poppies. Coquelicot means poppies. So, but the main subject is really the landscape, the sky, the poppies, the wind blowing the grass around. So you get it's not just a generic, it's not any time, it's this very specific time and a very specific effect of light. So what Monet in particular was after was momentary effects of light and momentary color. So once you start looking at Impressionist paintings, you start to notice this more in real life, is that the color of, say, a tree is not the same all day long. Maybe it's some kind of green, but the green changes. Like in the morning, it might be a yellowish green, and in the afternoon, around sunset, it might be a dark bluish green. So Monet was always trying to paint a very specific time of day and very specific light conditions in the landscape. And this is, okay, I put this in here but just as a contrast. This is like an old school landscape painting by an old school painter, Claude Lorrain. All right, he's sort of, yes, there was landscape, but it's usually a sort of idealized landscape of the Roman countryside, maybe with a castle or ruins and some animals or figures. That if you were going to paint a landscape like Claude did, and for some reason Claude Lorrain is always called Claude, it would be like this. You would draw every little branch on the tree. It might not be a very specific time of day. This could be kind of any time, although you see some shadows, but the shadows are not really consistent, like they're going this way. Well, yeah, I guess they are consistent. Well, anyway, it's not about momentary effects of light and color on these trees. The trees are going to be drawn pretty much the same no matter what time of day it is. So this is academic landscape painting, and Monet's painting takes issue with that, you could say, and says let's go beyond that. And also let's go beyond the idealized sort of pastoral landscape in the country. Let's look at our urban landscape, like what goes on in town where we spend most of our time. So in this case, Monet is painting the Gare Saint-Lazare, which is a train station in Paris. And it's the whole travel by train was new at this point in the 19th century, and this train station was new. So it would be like if you went to the Nashville airport where they're building a new parking garage and just sat down with your easel on the sidewalk there and started painting the parking garage. People would say, "What are you doing?" And you would say, "Well, I'm painting the parking garage." Why? It's just a parking garage. So it's not a subject that you would think would be a subject for a fairly large oil painting, but Monet is basically saying, look, this is our reality. This is modern life. This is what it's all about. Let's see what it looks like. Okay, so what you have here is the place. It's not even the fancy hotel or train station that's near the Gare Saint-Lazare. It's just the shed, basically, that the trains come into. Now, he's done a careful job of drawing, in a way, the shed, and even using linear perspective to draw the apartment buildings in the background, which were also new. These apartment buildings were built in the 19th century when France had a major sort of urban renewal where they tore down a lot of medieval streets and buildings and built these brand new apartment buildings and the trains and everything. And there's a bridge back here also. And the train is arriving into the station. To us, this looks like an old-fashioned train with a steam engine and, a smokestack and steam coming out of the train. How quaint and picturesque. But in the 19th century, that was not quaint and picturesque. It was just what trains looked like. Again, it would be like if you went to the airport and started painting a Southwest Airlines plane. People would think it was kind of weird. Okay, so there are people here. This thing here is a water tank because steam engines have to be refilled with water. Obviously, the coal burns. It drives the coal causes water to boil, and that creates steam, and the steam drives the pistons. That's how a steam engine works. That's how a lot of the industrial equipment worked in the 19th century. It was powered by steam. And so they have to refill the water tank at this boiler. So that's what's happening. The train is coming in here. Maybe it's already discharged the passengers, and it's going to fill up. They're going to fill up the boiler. But there are people here, maybe a guy who works there, and some other people, but they're not carefully drawn. They're almost like just little posts, you could say. Also, he's spent a great deal of time trying to draw the effect of light on the steam. So you can hardly even see the engine because of all the steam, right? And that's real. I mean, not too many of us have ever seen a steam engine because we don't use steam engine trains anymore. But, there'd be steam coming out the bottom and out the top, just a huge cloud of steam around the train. And he's, trying to paint that. There's light coming in from overhead from the glass windows in the roof. The steam is sort of obscuring these metal crossbars here. I guess they're just structural members of the shed kind of here. But so it's all about a particular time of day, a particular event, that is when this train's coming in, and what it actually looks like, the actual colors that are falling on your retina, regardless of what they represent. Like, he's not so concerned that this is a water tank. He's more concerned that that what it actually looked like, regardless of what it was at that. And that's a real revolution in painting. And I think you can see it even more clearly when we look at the human figure. Okay, so now we're talking about not Monet, but Renoir, another impressionist. Now, Renoir was academically trained, so he could paint a nude basically in the academic style. And, you know, in the academic style, you always put your hand over your vulva. That's a rule. Even Renoir didn't break that rule. So I guess it would take somebody in the 20th or 21st century to break that rule. But anyway, you know, keep your vulva covered at all times. All right, so she's taken her dress off. This is traditional, you know, academic nude. Her friend is back here, still has her dress on. I guess they're getting ready to go swimming or something, and she's got a little dog. Okay, so her skin, although in this slide it looks a little greenish, Renoir has painted human skin the way we sort of, in the color that we sort of expect a European skin to look, you know, sort of whitish, yellowish, pinkish or something. And it's that color all the way from top to bottom, right? And there's some modeling so that you can see that her body actually has volume and so on. But then 5 years later, Renoir was painting the nude female figure, again, an old subject, going back to prehistoric art, really. He's painting it in a completely different way. And it's a study, okay? That means it's not a finished painting. And he calls it effective sun. So why does he call it that? So here's a woman sitting under a tree with dappled light falling on her, as if the light is coming through the leaves in sort of irregular ways. So sometimes it's lighting up her arm or her breast, and sometimes there's a shadow line on her chest. So these colors range from pink to white to purple. Now, this may not look that weird to us, but to 19th century critics and viewers, it was very upsetting. It looked like she had a skin disease, because they wanted it to look like this. They wanted it to be about what's called the local color. The local color of your arm is that, okay? But if I go outside and put it under a tree, there's gonna be green and yellow and maybe even orange this time of year on there. So that's not local color, right? The local color of grass is green. The local color of skin is sort of pinkish brown. But the local color of these cabinets is reddish brown. But all of that can change because of light and the time of day and so on. And that's what the Impressionists were interested in, was these changing qualities of light, on the effect of that on skin and clothes and everything, grass. Okay, so we talked about the sort of importance of the lack of finish, the subject matter being landscape, and also the effects of light and color, on momentary effects of light and color. So here's a classic sort of impressionist subject matter. Middle-class people out for a walk in the suburbs of Paris, which they could now reach by train in an hour or so, and so on. Sunday afternoon, they'd get on the train and ride out to the suburbs and just have a nice walk by the river, in this case, in the suburb called Argenteuil. So you can see that Monet has put a whole lot of attention into the clouds, the sky, the shadows falling from the trees over here, and not that much attention really on the people in the boats or on the grass here. It's more about the weather, you could say. Here's another one at Argenteuil, the same suburb. And this is not a classic landscape painting. He doesn't really try to make this look far away, you know, using atmospheric perspective or something. He's just interested in how the reflections of these trees reflect off the water the reflection in the water is just as important as the thing itself. The end of the bridge here, or this tree, or the reflection of the clouds in the water, it's all equal, kind of. It's not like the boat is more important than the reflection of the boat. Okay, so all right, so probably as the 19th century went on, Monet took this further and further, this idea of momentary effects of light and color. And sometimes he would work on more than one painting at a time, because he had all these places that he was working on his paintings. He did this series about poplars alongside a river, and he did them from a boat. Actually, he was in a boat floating. Here's the water here, and he's looking at these poplars that were growing alongside this river. And the time of day that this painting was about, sort of late in the afternoon, was so specific that he could only work on this painting, say, for 15 minutes at a time before the light changed, and then he would have to move to another place to work on a different painting. He had his own garden where he did all this at Giverny, where he could, move around the garden working on different paintings during the day. In this case, the poplars line this canal or this river or whatever, and the line starts here, and then it curves around, and you can see this canopy of leaves, of gold leaves, that follows the canal, disappearing into the background. And at one point, I think Monet was almost finished with his painting, but the man who owned the poplars was going to cut them down, and he paid the man to leave them standing for another week or so he could finish working on this painting. There's a wonderful video in the content that you should watch about this painting, and it'd be good to look at some of the other videos. We don't really have time in the lecture to do that, but you can look on your own there's a link to it in your content. There's also a link to the video about Monet's water lily paintings, which similarly, this is almost abstract. When you look at it and it says the water lilies, you think, well, okay, what? All right, so here are the water lilies. These are little floating leaves that have flowers coming out of them at certain times of the year. But really what the painting is about is the reflection of the sky and the clouds in the water of this pond, this rather small pond, really, that Monet had built in his garden at Giverny. So these paintings are enormous. And he worked on them at the very end of his life, when he was in his 80s, after his wife had died and one of his sons had died, and he was kind of the only one left, and World War I was over, and he undertook this huge, and France suffered terribly during World War I. A huge number of French men were killed during World War I, something like a third of them. Not just in France, but also in England and Germany. It was a devastating war that we're going to talk about later. But suffice it to say that after all this loss and devastation, Monet, the last sort of big thing he did was these huge paintings. And this is just a small portion of those paintings. And that's why you should watch the video, because the video gives you a sense of the entire set of paintings. And the fact that they're displayed in a round building in Paris called the Orangerie. So he gave them to the country, to France, and they built a special museum for these paintings. And so when you go in the Orangerie, you're surrounded by these enormous paintings of Monet's pond, basically, with the water lilies floating in the surface and the trees leaning over the surface of the pond, and the reflection of the trees, and occasionally a flower or a fish. But it all looks very abstract. And in fact, this painting had a huge effect later on the American painter Jackson Pollock. And we're going to talk more about the similarities there when we get to Pollock. But suffice it to say now that, again, what's happening? I don't know. My screen went away. Stop sharing. Okay. Yeah, it's not about trying to make a realistic or naturalistic or representational painting of what the pond and the water lilies actually look like. It's more about, again, momentary effects of light and color, obvious brushwork. I mean, you can see the paint is laid on really thick, sort of impasto paint. So you always know it's a painting. You never start thinking, oh wow, that's really, I'm looking through a window at some water. No, you don't ever think that. You know it's paint. You know it's a two-dimensional surface. It's pretty upfront about that. But it's almost a sort of spiritual experience to be in the presence of these paintings that don't pretend to be anything other than paintings. You know, it's paint on canvas. And in that sense, Monet was anticipating or reflecting a lot of what the 20th century painting would be about, which is the flatness of the canvas and the actual physicality of putting paint on canvas as an act, you could say, the act of painting. So again, why can't I get out of this? I recommend that you look at those. Oh, stop share. That's what I want to do. Be sure to look at those videos that are linked to in the content, and you'll get more out of it, and you'll do better on the exam if you look at those videos. Because to understand these paintings, you kind of have to zoom in on them, and we can't really do that very easily in PowerPoint. But the videos do zoom in on them, and the art historians have a lot of interesting things to say. So if you take notes from the videos, you'll be in good shape. So I'm gonna stop recording now.